The story begins as a high-stakes meeting between silent men in black suits, is interrupted not by a rival gang, but by the soft sobbing of a small child in a plaid shirt. The sight of the most dangerous man in Seoul kneeling as his leather jacket creaks in a dim hallway creates an immediate narrative hook. The tension peaks when Eun-bi presents the physical proof of her trauma. Deep purple bruises on her forearm, just as her mother's presence is felt through an impending business deal. This forces Dae-hyun to choose between his cold criminal nature and a sudden, lethal protective instinct toward the girl who whispered, "Mommy did it." The heavy iron gates of the Kang estate ground open with a metallic shriek, admitting the boss's black sedan into a fortress of stone and shadow. Dae-hyun, a man who usually treated the world as a business of blood, stepped out of the vehicle. But instead of his usual cold, solitary entrance, he reached back into the leather interior. His large, scarred hand, the same hand that commanded fear with a glance, emerged holding the tiny, trembling fingers of a 7-year-old girl in a rumpled plaid shirt. As they entered the main hall, the air grew thick with the stunned silence of 12 pairs of eyes. These were hardened men, subordinates with neck tattoos and tailored suits who had seen the darkest corners of the underworld. They stood like statues, their breath hitching as they watched their ruthless chairman lead a small child into the heart of the wolf's den. The shock of the child approaching men who commanded terror created an immediate, suffocating tension in the room. Eun-bi shrank against Dae-hyun's leg, her gaze cast downward to hide her shame and fear. The harsh overhead lights of the estate caught the edge of the deep purple bruises on her forearm, still visible where her sleeve had shifted. One of the lieutenants stepped forward, his confusion breaking his professional mask. "Chairman, who is the child?" Dae-hyun didn't look up. His jaw remained tight with the suppressed rage that had ignited the moment she whispered, "Mommy did it," in that dim hallway. He gently adjusted the girl's sleeve to cover the marks, his leather jacket creaking in the absolute quiet. "She is the reason the world is going to burn," Dae-hyun replied, his voice a low, vibrating growl that promised the beginning of a calculated campaign of social and psychological execution. He looked at his men, his eyes narrowing into the lethal gaze of a predator turned guardian. "Prepare the guest suite. And if a single person here makes her cry, you'll answer to me." The syndicate stood paralyzed, watching the collision of absolute power and pure innocence as Dae-hyun led the girl toward the stairs. The fortress was no longer just a place of business. It had become a sanctuary for a broken child protected by the most dangerous man in Seoul. The blue light of a dozen monitors washed over Dae-hyun's face, casting sharp shadows across his brow as he sat in the center of his high-tech command room. On every screen, the same woman smiled back, a vision of grace in ivory silk. Park Chae-young was the darling of Seoul's elite, a woman whose name was synonymous with the Sunshine Foundation for Children. The digital files listed her as a saint, a tireless philanthropist who dedicated her life to the vulnerable. It was a perfect paper mask, crafted with the precision of a master forger. "Chairman," a specialist whispered, his fingers dancing across a keyboard. "On the surface, she's untouchable. The public loves her. But the deeper we dig into the Foundation's private ledgers, the more the ink starts to bleed." The investigator opened a folder labeled Private Residences. There were no photos of charity galas here. Instead, there were internal security logs from a luxury penthouse that Chae-young thought she had scrubbed clean years ago. They found receipts for private, off-the-books medical consultations and a trail of frantic hush-money payments to 3 different nannies who had vanished from the city within 48 hours of being hired. Then, the specialist played a single, recovered audio file from a nursery nanny cam. It wasn't the sound of a mother's lullaby. It was the cold, rhythmic striking of a belt against a child's muffled cries, followed by Chae-young's voice, sharp and devoid of a soul, calling her own daughter a useless mistake for simply spilling a glass of water. Dae-hyun didn't flinch, but the glass in his hand cracked under the pressure of his grip. He stared at the center screen where Chae-young was pictured accepting an award for child advocacy. The irony was a bitter poison. The woman who marketed herself as the protector of the innocent was the very predator who had broken the little girl currently sleeping under his protection. "She hides behind the light to do her work in the dark," Dae-hyun said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that filled the room. Strip it away. Every donation, every award, every influential friend. I want her to see the world exactly as she made Eun-bi see it. Cold, lonely, and without a single place to hide. The campaign of social and psychological execution had officially begun. Park Chae-young stood at the center of a velvet-lined boutique, her chin held high as she slid her black titanium credit card across the counter. She didn't even look at the price of the handcrafted bag. For a woman of her stature, the cost was irrelevant. But the familiar chime of a successful transaction never came. Instead, a heavy, uncomfortable silence filled the room as the clerk's polite smile faltered. "I'm terribly sorry, Ms. Park," the clerk whispered, sliding the card back with a trembling hand. "The system indicates the account has been restricted. Perhaps another card." Chae-young's eyes flashed with a hint of the sharp cruelty she usually reserved for the dark corners of her penthouse. She produced a second card, then a third. One by one, they were met with the same cold, digital rejection. It wasn't a glitch, it was a surgical strike. In the reflection of the store's glass entrance, she caught sight of a man in a tailored black suit watching her, one of Dae-hyun's shadows, offering nothing but a stony, predatory stare before vanishing into the crowd. She reached for her phone to call her bank, but the screen was already flooded with notifications. Invitations to the season's most prestigious galas were being retracted in real time. Her Sunshine Foundation board members were resigning via automated emails, citing unforeseen ethical concerns. The social fabric of her life was unraveling at the seams. As she stepped out onto the sidewalk, the socialites who usually clamored for her favor suddenly found intense interest in their own phones, crossing the street to avoid her path. The whispers had already begun. Leaks about financial irregularities and a looming investigation that made her name radioactive. Dae-hyun's campaign was working with lethal, silent precision. He wasn't just taking her wealth. He was stripping away the ivory tower she had used to hide her crimes. Chae-young felt a sudden, chilling realization. She was no longer the predator. For the first time in her life, she was completely alone in a city that had once been at her feet. Across the street, a black sedan sat idling, its dark windows reflecting her growing panic. The wolf was no longer just at the gate. He had dismantled her world, leaving her exposed and defenseless in the cold. Dae-hyun stood in the center of the toy aisle, a towering shadow amidst a sea of plush bears and pastel colors. The store was silent, cleared by a single phone call that had sent the staff into the back rooms. His leather jacket creaked as he shifted his weight, a sound that usually signaled a violent ultimatum to those who dared cross the syndicate. Now, it only underscored his profound uncertainty. Beside him, Eun-bi stood perfectly still, her small hand clutching the hem of her plaid shirt, her eyes wide with the terrified habit of remaining invisible. "Pick one," Dae-hyun said, his voice a low rumble. It was the same voice that had commanded his men to find her, but the lethal edge was replaced by a strange, heavy hesitation. Eun-bi didn't move. She looked at the rows of toys, then back at the floor. She had spent years being told by Chae-young that she was a mistake, and in her world, wanting something was a dangerous provocation. Dae-hyun watched her, his jaw tightening as he saw her stare at a soft, white plush rabbit but refused to reach for it. He knelt, his large frame casting a protective shadow, until he was at her eye level, just as he had been in the dim hallway where she first showed him her bruises. "You aren't a mistake, little one," he whispered, echoing his promise from the night they met. His scarred hand reached out but stopped short of her shoulder, as if afraid his world of blood would stain her innocence. He picked up the rabbit. It was absurdly soft, a jarring contrast to the calloused palms of a man who commanded fear with a glance. He held it out to her like a peace offering. Eun-bi reached out, her tiny fingers brushing against his before she pulled the toy to her chest. For the first time, the paralyzing fear in her eyes flickered, replaced by a fragile, tentative wonder. Dae-hyun stood up, his gaze hardening as he looked toward the storefront. He was a man who lived by a business of blood. He didn't know how to protect without destroying, but as he watched her hug the toy, he realized that to keep this small light burning, he would have to become the darkest nightmare Park Chae-young would ever encounter. The ivory silk of Chae-young's blouse was stained with sweat and the grit of a Seoul back alley, a place she once wouldn't have looked at from her limousine window. Her perfect life was a smoldering ruin. Every door in the high society circles had slammed shut, and the silence from her foundation was deafening. But as she paced the cramped, smoke-filled backroom of a third-rate gambling den, her fear had calcified into a jagged, narcissistic rage. She didn't blame herself for the bruises on Eun-bi's arm. She blamed the wolf who had stolen her property. Kang Dae-hyun, she spat, the name tasting like copper in her mouth. She had finally made the connection. The silent men in black suits, the surgical freezing of her empire. It wasn't a legal audit. It was a declaration of war from the head of the syndicate. She had tried to reach out to her political friends, only to find they had vanished like smoke at the mention of Dae-hyun's name. They were terrified of him, but she was beyond terror. She was desperate. Across the scarred wooden table sat a man with a jagged scar across his throat. Chairman Choi, the leader of a rival syndicate that had long hungered for a piece of Dae-hyun's territory. He toyed with a heavy gold ring, his eyes scanning Chae-young with a mixture of amusement and predatory interest. "You're asking me to go to war with the dragon for a child?" Choi asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. "I'm asking you to protect my interests," she hissed, slamming a velvet box onto the table. Inside sat a diamond necklace worth more than the gambling den itself, the last of her liquid assets. "He took what belongs to me. If you can't get the girl back, then make sure he never breathes another word about what he thinks he found in my penthouse." She wasn't looking for safety. She was looking for a way to restore her mask. In her mind, Eun-bi was nothing more than a loose end that needed to be tied or silenced. Choi grinned, a slow, ugly movement that didn't reach his eyes. He took the box, the deal sealed in the dark. Chae-young felt a surge of triumph, unaware that by inviting another monster to the table, she had only accelerated the inevitable. The campaign of social and psychological execution was about to turn into a literal business of blood. The air in the command room was frigid, chilled by the massive servers humming in the walls. Dae-hyun stood motionless behind his lead hacker, his reflection ghost-like against the wall of monitors. They had bypassed the final layer of Chae-young's encrypted private vault, a digital sanctuary where she kept the things she couldn't risk the world seeing. "We're in, Chairman," the hacker whispered, his voice trembling slightly. He knew the weight of what they were about to witness. A series of windows blossomed across the screens. It wasn't just bank statements or legal documents. It was a feed from a hidden camera installed in the nursery of Chae-young's penthouse, disguised as a smoke detector. The date on the timestamp was from only 3 days before Dae-hyun had found Eun-bi in that hallway. The footage began in silence. Chae-young walked into the frame, her face, usually so composed and radiant, contorted into a mask of pure, ugly malice. She wasn't the philanthropist now. She was a predator. On the screen, a small, familiar figure in a plaid shirt sat on the floor, trying to piece together a broken ceramic vase. Then the audio kicked in. The sound of a sharp slap echoed through the command room, followed by the jagged, breathless gasps of a child trying not to cry. "You're a stain on my life," Chae-young's voice hissed through the speakers, every word a serrated blade. "Every time I look at you, I see a mistake I should have erased." The footage showed the mother gripping Eun-bi's arm, the same arm Dae-hyun had held so gently, and twisting until the child fell to her knees in pain. Dae-hyun's subordinates lowered their heads, unable to look. Dae-hyun himself didn't blink. His eyes remained fixed on the screen, recording every second of Eun-bi's agony. His hands were clasped behind his back, his knuckles white enough to tear through his skin. The suppressed rage that had been simmering since the hallway discovery finally reached its boiling point. "Is the quality high enough for the gala screens?" Dae-hyun asked, his voice so quiet it was almost a ghost. "Crystal clear, sir," the hacker replied. "Good." Dae-hyun turned away from the digital carnage, his leather jacket creaking in the silence. "The paper mask is gone. Now we tear off the skin." Park Chae-young stepped into the grand ballroom of the Shilla Hotel, the weight of her emerald silk gown acting as a familiar, comforting armor. She had received the gold invitation only hours earlier, a silent signal that her exile from high society was over, or so she desperately believed. Her heart hammered a frantic, triumphant rhythm against her ribs. She was back. The Sunshine Foundation Gala was the stage she needed to reclaim her narrative and silence the whispers of ruin that had haunted her for days. As she moved through the crowd, She felt the familiar high of being watched. She ignored the way the light caught the jagged edges of her diamonds, focusing instead on the stage where a massive high-definition screen stood dark. Having hired Chairman Choi to handle the wolf, she assumed the recent silence from the syndicate meant Kang Dae-hyun had been muzzled. She adjusted her silk gloves, hiding the slight trembling of her fingers, and donned the smile that had fooled the world for years. It was the perfect paper mask, radiant and utterly hollow. From a shadowed balcony overlooking the floor, Kang Dae-hyun watched her. His rugged leather jacket had been replaced by a tuxedo of midnight wool, but his eyes remained those of a predator. He didn't look like a guest. He looked like a god of judgment. Below him, his men were positioned at every exit, their tailored suits hiding the weapons that usually settled his business of blood. "She looks happy," a lieutenant whispered beside him. "Let her have the moment," Dae-hyun replied, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that promised the end. A fall is only felt when you believe you're at the top. Chae-young reached the center of the room, raising a glass of champagne to a group of socialites who hesitated, then turned toward the stage as the lights began to dim. She expected a video tribute to her charity work. She stood tall, basking in the spotlight, unaware that the digital trap had already closed. The gala wasn't her comeback, it was her public execution. And the wolf was finally ready to pull back the curtain on the monster hiding in plain sight. The ballroom held its breath as the massive screen flickered to life. Park Chae-young stood at the podium, her smile poised and practiced, waiting for the montage of her humanitarian achievements to begin. But the bright, polished music never played. Instead, the high-definition speakers let out a jarring, static crackle, followed by a sound that made every socialite in the room freeze. The sharp, rhythmic strike of a belt against a child's muffled sobs. The screen didn't show the Sunshine Foundation's logo. It showed the raw, grainy reality of a nursery. The elite of Seoul watched in horrified silence as their saint appeared on screen, her face twisted with a malice that the ivory silk of her gown could no longer hide. They saw her grip a small girl in a plaid shirt, the child she had hidden from the world, and heard the venom in her voice as she called her own daughter a mistake. The glass in Chae-young's hand shattered, champagne spilling like blood onto the marble floor. She looked up at the screen, her paper mask finally dissolving into a jagged, panicked mess. The room, once filled with sycophants, was now a sea of disgusted whispers. "It's a lie. This is a deep fake," she shrieked, her voice cracking as she turned toward the crowd, looking for a single ally. But there was no one. "It's the truth you thought you scrubbed clean," a low, vibrating voice echoed from the balcony. Kang Dae-hyun stepped into the spotlight, his presence alone commanding the room. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a god of judgment. He had already dealt with Chairman Choi. The rival gang was a footnote in a business of blood he had finished hours ago. As if on cue, the heavy doors of the ballroom swung open. This time, it wasn't the mafia, but the authorities, led by a detective holding an arrest warrant that Dae-hyun had ensured was airtight. The flash of steel handcuffs was the final punctuation to her career. As Chae-young was led away, screaming about her status, while her emerald gown dragged on the floor, Dae-hyun didn't look at her. He looked at his phone, at a photo of Eun-bi sleeping safely with her new rabbit. The social and psychological execution was complete. The wolf had finished his hunt. 15 years had passed since the creak of a leather jacket first broke the silence of a dim hallway. The grand auditorium of the medical school was filled with the hum of proud families, but at the center of the stage stood a young woman whose poise was as sharp as a diamond. Eun-bi, no longer the trembling child in the plaid shirt, stepped toward the podium to receive her honors. Her arms, once hidden by long sleeves to mask deep purple bruises, were now bare and strong, holding her degree with a confidence that had been forged in the sanctuary of the wolf's den. She had become a healer, a path chosen to mend the lives of others just as her own had been mended. She didn't look for a mother in the crowd. Park Chae-young was a ghost of the past, a hollow name still associated with the final verdict that had ended her reign of cruelty years ago. Instead, Eun-bi's eyes scanned the very back of the hall. She knew he was there. She could feel the weight of a gaze that had guarded her through every nightmare and every triumph, providing the invisible protection of the dragon. In the deepest shadows of the upper balcony, a man sat alone. His hair was streaked with silver now, but his presence still commanded the air around him. Kang Dae-hyun watched his daughter with a suppressed pride that no syndicate victory could ever match. He had navigated the unfamiliar territory of fatherhood, learning that his true legacy wasn't written in the business of blood, but in the safety and success of the girl he had rescued. As Eun-bi looked toward the shadows, she offered a small, knowing smile. The chairman didn't need to step into the light. His silent watch was the only validation she required. He stood up, his leather jacket, worn and familiar, creaking as he turned to leave before the crowd could notice him. He remained the guardian in her life, a protector watching from the dark so she could forever walk in the light. Eun-bi was finally, and forever, safe.